Hi, Steve Hayes here, and welcome to episode 4 of what appears to be my podcast, as yet unnamed. I want to talk about a few things of this episode. I want to talk briefly about a blog that is attached to this video about self-kindness and how to show yourself the kind of kindness that you would appreciate or it's shown to you by another person, or that you would want to display to those that you love. I want to talk about 2 studies that just come across my desk that I think are kind of cool, or interesting, at least. Not necessarily cool. At least one of them is a little depressing. And then maybe finish up with just a couple of minutes on the topic of free will. Why? Because somebody sent me an email today, and I thought it was a darn good question. On the issue of self-kindness and the blog that's attached, I just walked through briefly some of the things that you might do when you have that mind of yours beating yourself about the head and ears. I mean, we treat ourselves in ways that are far, far, far less kind than we would ever treat anybody else. And that we respond to that constant flow of criticism and judgment the same way that we respond when other people criticize and judge us. We tend to shut down, narrow down, slog forward, mentally defend ourselves. And so there's a little acronym that's in the blog, NOTE, which walks through some really key features of how to show yourself a self-kindness, and that includes showing kindness to the part of you that's not being kind to you. Because, of course, we're a collection. These are all features of us. And if we really want these more vulnerable parts of us, these quieter parts of us, these younger parts of us, these parts of us that may even go back to times when it was virtually pre-verbal, where we barely knew how to interpret, describe, understand what it was that we were experiencing, if we want that. And I think we should, because we only get this kind of judgmental repertoire really fully going later in life, number one. And even then, it's constantly missing the details, the grit and grain, the things that are really of importance. It doesn't really know how to appreciate a sunset or to feel the joy of hugging somebody you love, or to smell the neck of a new baby, or just to look with kindness at yourself. It doesn't know how. It's not what it evolved for. It evolved to solve problems. It's great that we have that repertoire. Not so great when we turn our life over to it. So I tried to write with the shortest, quick way of getting to an act of self-kindness by treating yourself as noteworthy. And you'll know what I mean when you read the blog. The 2 studies I'm going to talk about, one, it's a retrospective study, and it has a lot of methodological problems. Some of you will see this video, you head off into YouTube, and if you don't fight yourself back to my website or the original blog, you may not see the things that are written down. And coming ahead, I'm going to start trying to do these blogs in ways that would allow me to partially share my screen with some video information. But for where I am right now, I'm just creating bit.ly links, if you know how those work. Just bit.ly/. And the first article, the letters that you follow it with are TRIP with a capital T, PF capitalized for psychological flexibility, and racial trauma, also capitalized of each word, no spaces, TRIP, PF, racial flexibility after bit.ly/. And then it'll take you to an open access article that looks retrospectively at people who suffered racial trauma, racial discrimination, and have found help as a result of psychedelic therapy or psychedelic trips. And because this is retrospective, you really have to put a little asterisk around it methodologically. There's increasingly a number of really interesting studies that are not of this kind. They're actually experimental studies using ACT as a kind of wrapper for that work. But there's something transformational that often happens in psychedelic work at its best. Please, we're not talking about redoing the 60s. We're talking about being able to use these chemicals in ways very much like the indigenous people have always used them, as a way of self-exploration and self-development in a controlled environment. But if you look at the features that predict positive outcomes, and then you look at this positive outcome of a decrease in the impact, the trauma of racial discrimination, we know that for a significant number of people, this can help reorient themselves in ways that soothes those wounds. And some of those experiences that occur that correlate positively with those outcomes. We see in this study, if you go and look, that they appear to be mediated by psychological flexibility. It'll be far more convincing when this is done experimentally, but I'm not surprised by the data. I think a lot of our traditions, psychotherapy traditions, wisdom traditions, and yes, the use of mind-altering chemicals, which has been here as long as human beings have been on the planet, as part of what indigenous peoples have found is helpful to help people step up to the challenges of the human condition. I believe those have a scientific explanation that go beyond merely the chemicals themselves, your brain, or various theories that are out there in our wisdom and psychotherapy traditions, some of which are just not oriented towards experimental science. And so what does this say? Well, it fits with a whole range of studies that is now saying that part of alleviating the impact of racial discrimination is to help with tools that allow people to walk through the hell of that kind of history and arrive at a place that is personally empowering. The second article is a really interesting, large secondary analysis of a huge database called the Medical Expenditures Panel Survey, MEPS, all capitalized. It's been underway for many years, funded by an outfit called AHRQ, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, which is part of the federal government. What they've been doing is to getting truly representative samples, and fairly large ones, of the entire US population, interviewing them, following them for 2 years about all kinds of health matters, including mental health matters, and then even checking in with the objective records of what employers know and so on. So it's not simply self-report. It's verified, or at least in parallel, partially verified, representative data across the entire nation. It's a ginormous database and grows every year. And in this study, which you can access by simply doing bit.ly, and then after the / do MEPS, and then the word depression, capitalizing the letter D. bit.ly links care about capitalization, so you have to do it right. MEPSD, all capitalized, and the rest of the word, how can I even say it? The rest of the word depression that's not capitalized, following BIT period LY /. And what you'll see is a study that looked at the approximately 17 million or 17.46 or so million people that reported experiencing depression and had self-report measures that indicated that, somewhere around 60% of which had antidepressant medications. And what this study does, is it looks at those data from 2005 all the way to 2018, all of the people who had at least 2 years of follow-up. And it asks the question, do people get better over time, over that follow-up period, if they've taken antidepressants compared to if they haven't? And in one analysis, they answer that question simply. And another one, they add all the covariates that they can think to add that are there in the database and say, after accounting for all of those, age and comorbidities and things of that kind, how does it look? And they looked also in 2 areas. They looked at various areas of quality of life using the SF-36, and which looks at mental prosperity, or how you're doing well mentally and how you're doing physically. The long and the short of it, while there is an improvement mentally but not physically when you're using antidepressants, it's no different than if you don't. Now, I think there's a variety of ways to think about this. There's a vast amount of literature, a lot of it touched by big pharma. You have to worry about how clean it is, but showing that you can get some positive effects from antidepressants. There are also a lot of data suggesting that there are side effects that are harmful, some of them lasting a long time, and often not pursued initially by big pharma. They had to be forced to do the black box warnings about increases in suicidality, for example. Still to this day, you have a hard time really finding good data. They're there, you have to dig for them on how many people have sexual side effects, some of which seem to be very long lasting, even after the medications have stopped. Sexual anhedonia, things of that kind. But we have a lot of data that indicate the effect sizes of these medications are small. They tend to be not long lasting, and they tend to create side effects that are worrisome. And they tend to be massively prescribed. What are we going to do with that as a culture, as a human community, as a species? What are we going to do with that? I think one thing that we need to start doing with that is start thinking of people as individuals. There was a large study done on major depressive disorder, the kind of study that NIMH, the National Institute on Mental Health, used to fund and has kind of stopped doing, the so-called STAR-D trial, in which 3,700 people diagnosed in that way were examined. And if you look at just the problems that they have that would lead to the diagnosis, how many different combinations of problems led to the diagnosis out of that 3,700 people? And the answer is more than 1,000. How many people had a combination that was so rare, so unusual, so idiosyncratic, so odd, that only approximately 1/100% of the total population, in other words, another 4 or 5 people out of the whole sample of nearly 4,000, had the same problems that a given individual had? And the answer is nearly half. I don't think this means we should say there's nothing there inside this concept of depression, or that antidepressants aren't helpful for anybody ever, or anything like that. I think what this means is we have to stop treating individuals as error terms. We simply have to stop. Every voice matters, and that means every individual and their particular trajectories, how they have responded to the interventions and the problems that they have and the psychological processes, including psychological flexibility that they deploy or not, how all of that goes together to produce what we call psychopathology, to produce what we call prosperity, and to produce those many instances in which we move from one to the other, positive and negative. And that's really where I'm trying to put my professional work. And you're going to see a lot more of it if you keep following me, because I am determined that we're going to stop treating people as error terms, whether that is a BIPOC person, a racial or ethnic minority, subjected to discrimination, or a person who is struggling with issues of sadness or other emotions that lead to what we call depression, or whatever these more normative concepts lead us to. We need to start listening to each individual. And if I can loop back to the blog, that starts with you. One reason why self-kindness is so important is the messages of your history that speak into the present moment are not necessarily spoken in clear words. They're not necessarily spoken in a way that your problem-solving mind can get. They may be nothing more than a little flip of your heart or a sinking of your stomach, a little change in your attentional process or a rising sense of foreboding. And if you're not listening, if you're not noting it, if you're not observing and describing it, you're simply doing what I think psychology has done for far too long, which is to analyze people without hearing their voice. Every voice matters, from everyone. I think I'll pass on the promise that I'll get to free will. I know this is getting a little long, and so I'm going to stop there, but I'll put it on the list. It'll be on a few future podcast, and I look forward to being with you again. Same bat time and the same bat channel. Peace, love, and life.